All right, everyone, we start off today talking about polling, specifically Biden's approval polling, because right now he's had a very sharp uptick in disapproval. And keep in mind, I'm using the RCP aggregate here as I usually do. However, caveat, there's a big cautionary warning here. His aggregated approval is being dragged heavily upwards by push polling. I've already analyzed that a little bit. Like Harris, the Hill poll, has him at plus 22. Biden's approval is not in the 60s. To be clear, that's an outlier even among push polls. So we're going to analyze the raw numbers here a little bit, and I'll explain, I think, why what's happening right now is occurring. First and foremost, though, if you're watching this video on YouTube, take a look down below. There will be a pinned comment with links to 4 other video hosting sites that I use: Odyssey, BitChute, Dailymotion, and Rumble. Keep in mind, I make 4 videos a day, although today it'll be 5 because I have a literary update to do. Only 2 of them end up on YouTube. Today, of course, 3. Now, what is Biden's actual approval? We don't know. I would guess if I could give an actually accurate number, it would be in the mid-40s, which is to say roughly where Trump was. And the reason why I don't think his approval is where the aggregate is here, number one, I mean, you've got some push polls going on. The approval aggregate is 52.3 and falling, disapproval 43.7 and sharply rising, especially over the last week. I wonder why. That being said, I think those numbers are wrong because of push polling, number one. And number two, we have a hyper-political climate. It would be extremely difficult for any politician in that position. It doesn't matter how well they do, how poorly they do. It would be difficult for their approval to reach, I think, above the low 50s. I think that pushing 53% approval would be miraculous if Biden were able to ever do that. But the thing is, that number relies upon a plus 22 poll among polls in which he's close to 50-50. For instance, you've got YouGov. You've got Rasmussen. Rasmussen shows him slightly below water. YouGov barely above at 51. You have other polls. You've got 53, 52, 49. They're all within a small margin. But then you have the Hill poll that, I mean, it's outdated anyway. It's from the 9th. That's when the polling period ended, and yet it shows him at 61% approval. Every Hill poll has shown him well above the rest of the aggregate, which is why Biden's fans, of course, they completely ignore all of the other polling. They ignore the aggregate especially, and they've been doing nothing but focusing on the Hill poll. Like the Gravel Institute, less them at this point because they don't like him as much because he's stabbed the entire left in the back, but certainly like the Lincoln Project fanboys, you know, the ones that used to pretend to be Republican during the election to grift money. They pretended to be disaffected Republicans so they could get those never Trump bucks from the Mitt Romneyites of the world, and they cleaned up, they bought one billboard and did some tweeting, and that's basically all they're good for. That and sheltering Bob Weaver. But the polling, what it does show, again, at this point, the aggregate can't give you the real number. The problem is that you've got polling methodologies like for the Hill that are completely insane and completely different from other polling methodologies. It remains to be seen whether this is the result of them adjusting their sampling for turnout, because if you're adjusting it for perceived turnout, of course, you're going to weight things heavily in the Democrats' favor. The problem with doing that, as we've seen, this led to the debacle of the 2016 and 2018 polling problems, where Democrats were oversampled, and so a much rosier picture for what was going to happen with Hillary Clinton or the Dems in the midterms was painted, and it didn't come true because of that flawed methodology. If you take that same, though, flawed methodology and you increase it even further for the 2020 election turnout, again, perceived, honk honk, it was fortified, you're going to have a wrongful sample. It could also be that it's on purpose. Beijing Biden is not particularly popular. He's got a very small amount of hardened support. Most of his support is soft. You don't see nearly the fervor for Biden, like even in echo chamber Twitter and places like that. You just don't see the same fire, the same fervor for him that you see for many other Democrats. Like if you look at Hillary Clinton, she had a reasonably large core of hardened support. She had fewer supporters overall, I think, actually. That I would admit to be true. But the hardened core was larger. The soft support was less as a proportion. With Biden, it's almost all soft support. So what you see is a situation where there aren't that many people who strongly approve of him. There are people who compare him to Orange Man, or rather the straw man of Orange Man they were force-fed for several years. Now, they were told that Trump was a fascist and going to destroy grandma and stuff, so naturally you have Biden and they're like, oh, thank God the fascist is out of office, if you believe CNN and MSNBC and stuff. And you got Dem partisans, they're going to support him anyway, more or less. At this point, though, I see the leftists jumping. I think that most of this loss is from the left. Trump fans never approved of Biden to begin with. Many independent voters never approved of him to begin with. I think this represents the left souring on him because repeatedly he has let them down. Keep in mind, the only thing that this chart can show you, link in the description, archived of course. By the way, every week or so you'll have to archive it again so it has the new numbers, otherwise you're looking at old data. So be careful of that when you're looking at archives. Sometimes the data is not 100% up to date if it's something like this, like an aggregate for polls. But it can show you the trajectory. You can draw a best fit line on his disapproval and see it rising significantly over time. And keep in mind, this is only a few months. This isn't even a full half year. If this trend were to continue, his disapproval would presumably be at about 50% by the end of his first year in office. And that would be, again, in an aggregate that's including push polls, in an aggregate that has a margin of error. I don't see good things for his presidency. The asterisk administration. I think the Democrats are going to get hammered in the midterms unless the Republicans do what they sometimes do, which is snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Don't underestimate their ability to do that. Now, as long as Mitch McConnell's smelling the daisies from above, at the very least they have someone in there who understands strategy. But with regards to the general leadership of the Republican Party, they should just put in Trump as the head of the RNC. They should let Trump run the show. He has more finesse, knows what he's doing. I'm still looking, again, and then let's do a little brief analysis here about what the midterms as well mean for 2024. If the Democrats get hammered in the midterms, it makes Trump look really good, especially if candidates he has endorsed, campaigned for, has camaraderie with, or that sound like him are the ones doing well. There's no reason to believe this won't be the case. I think, personally, that at this particular time, people who are anti-com, so to speak, people who oppose leftism, should be organizing to try to take over the Republican Party. They should be doing this on the local as well as state level, not just the federal level, by primarying out the old Mitt Romneys, the Liz Cheneys, get rid of the dross, shoo the critters out of the party, clean the skeletons out of its closet, and stock it with some fresh blood. But they should also be focusing on the local level, because keep in mind, you can fortify an election if the states haven't reformed their election systems to make sure people have to show ID, to make sure people aren't just, filing off 10, 20 mail-in ballots. There's a reason why virtually no other developed nation in the entire world allows mass mail-in ballots, because of fraud. This is the reason why nobody in Europe does it. But for some reason, all the Democrats that wax happy about thoughts of Europe and how wonderful it would be if the United States were just more like Western Europe, all of a sudden they don't say that when it comes to mail-in ballots. You may have noticed that. This, though, I think shows bad things for Biden, which trickles down the ballot. The problem is you've got a schism within the Democratic Party, too. You're going to end up with a Dem party that's basically represented by even more freaks and weirdos, I think, after the midterms, because the only people that'll be safe are coming from solidly blue areas that expect them to be socialistic. They're not expecting, and then a handful of people like Joe Manchin. Those are the people that survive. The people in the middle that are doing most of the negotiating will get shoved aside, I think, by far leftists that are resulting in this. The numbers that I see here, that's like 5 or 6 points of additional disapproval. I think that's people who are further left than Elizabeth Warren, myself. It's not Manchin fans. It's not Trump fans. It's not independent voters. Maybe some left-leaning independents, but a lot of them, just because you're an independent, you don't claim party affiliation doesn't mean you're not far left. That is a chunk of independent voters. Those people aren't sold on the Democratic Party. There are right-leaning independent voters that would sound like Marjorie Taylor Greene but don't have an R after their name. I'm an independent voter, but I have my own personal leanings, both for and against both parties, by the way, including the LP at this point. When I look at these numbers, though, I don't see a midterm victory for the Democrats at this particular rate of loss. I think Biden is below water probably by the end of this year, or at least nearly so. Again, in an aggregate being dragged in his favor by cherry-picked push polls, or at the very least polls that are way off kilter with faulty methodology. That's about all. Peace out.